Right now, in Season 3, we are living in a pretty interesting situation, because we have been mentioning since the start of this season that we have quite the decent, quite the varied amount of options when it comes to playing in Mythic Plus. We were kind of worried about just how varied and how many options you would have gotten in Mythic Plus when it came to the meta, when it came to the flavor of the month picks after the traumatic experience of Season 2 of having the Exodia comp dominate Mythic Plus, and we were congratulating the beginning of Season 3 for having way more options, even looking at a 25 plus level of keys, which is less than 1% of the Mythic Plus player base. You still have 3 workable tanks as your options. You also have at least 4 different working healers as your options, as well as at least 2 to 3 melee DPS, not only 5 or so range DPS. So when it came to Mythic Plus, at the very least, the variety of your options this season has been quite good. However, we are now in an alternate reality where the amount of options have been going down, not in Mythic Plus, but in the raid. Because in this season we have been seeing a harder and harder ability of guilds to be able to mix and match and slot all of the necessary buffs and debuffs and requirements for each of the raid compositions. One of the, for example, bigger cases of this is the sudden pop-up of something like Feral Druid in your Mythic raid compositions. You're like, what? It's out of nowhere, I didn't think it would be that powerful. Well, it's not even that. It's the fact that Balanced Druid later down in this Amirdrassil raid is proving too weak. Not even that much in terms of damage, more so in terms of defensiveness and survivability. So you are now forced, if you don't want to move away from your default healer comp and your default tanks, to slot in a Feral Druid. You can also have other examples where if you are one of the comps that is not running the default DK Paladin, but you want to run a Brewmaster Monk, then you need a second Paladin for your second aura somewhere else. Similarly, if you're not running your Monk from your healer spot, then you need to find a spot for your Monk somewhere else. And of course, if you don't have a Priest healer, then you need to find... Never mind, nobody is playing Shadow Priest, so whatever. But you get the point. The point is that compared to the other tiers of this expansion, so far this tier has proven to be more strict, more limited in the amount of options you have in your compositions. This is quite visible when we put the 3 tiers of the expansions next to each other. The first one in line is Vault of the Incarnates, and these were the picks, for example, the average picks in the tier, especially now we're looking at the last bosses of the tier, the harder ones, right? The ones for where you start thinking about your composition way more. When you were doing Vault of the Incarnates, you didn't care too much about the composition on Sennarth or on Kurog, and way more about things like Diurna and Razaget. And then you have the ones for Aberrus, the compositions, for example, for Neltarion compared to the one right now for Tindral. You can see right off the bat that while the tank popularity of all 3 tiers is more or less the same, you have a couple of tanks, you have the pair of tanks making up 60 to 70% of the options. Where it gets more different is in the other roles. For example, the healers, you can see here the multiple choices of the healer options in Vault of the Incarnates, with the highest one at the time being the very powerful Preservation Evoker, but you still had a decent presence all the way down to Restoration Druid, with only just a couple of healer options below the 3% pick rate in your raid compositions. Then you move to Aberrus, once more you have at least 5 picks above 3% and only 2. Once more, our friend Mr. Monk being amongst the least played. And then in the last tier, you have the Revenge of Mr. Monk now actually being a popular one, but then you just lose all the other healers. There is no presence whatsoever of Resto Shaman, no presence of Holy Priest, very little of Restoration Druid and Preservation Evoker. You do have a similar note when it comes to the melee DPS. You can see the red numbers in Vault of the Incarnates, meaning the less than popular options that are still being played somewhat. The same goes for Aberus. Basically, all of the melees are red. They are all at or below 10% play rate. Meanwhile, in Amirdrassil, it's much different. You have a set of melee DPS basically picked at a very similar level, with the outlier of Havoc, and all the others have their similar pick rate, and then the rest basically disappears. What gets even worse, and it's definitely the biggest discrepancy from the previous tiers, is the ranged. The ranged of Amirdrassil are made up in almost 60% of picks by just two choices: Beast Mastery and Augmentation. Compare this to Aberus and look at the amount of options. To get to the 60% pick rate of just two specs in Amirdrassil, you have to pick 6 different options in Aberus. And it's only slightly different in Vault of the Incarnates with Balanced Druid. And this is slightly unfair because we are looking at the Urna, which was a very good one for a Balanced Druid, not nearly as popular when you go over Razaget. But the result is more or less the same. You have plenty more options than the one we are seeing right now in Amirdrassil. This is likely nowadays to do with how important multiple mandatory buffs have been expanded in your raid comp. Even if you look at your standard comp, nowadays you can pretty much say that having an Enhancement Shaman for the extra melee damage of Wind Fury is now a mandatory one. You also now have the Atrophic Poison given by a Rogue, which is also a mandatory pick nowadays, as well as, after the rework, the second pick of a Paladin for the second Aura has become a mandatory pick. So even just in this expansion, already we have found 3 more mandatory default picks to include in a raid, and we can even say 1 extra evoker, even though sure, the cooldown reduction on your movement ability and your Zephyr and things like that are not really mandatory, are not really a must to have. We have still had 1 evoker at least in every single kill of every single tier of this expansion. So when you add these 4 specs to the mandatory buffs we already have in the game, at this point you're basically looking at this comp and you're like, this is mandatory, this is mandatory, one of these is mandatory, this is also mandatory, 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 also mandatory, also mandatory, also mandatory. So you're only left with a few options for you to pick that you're not forced to use. 5 or 6 options that you can choose yourself, while the other 14 to 15 choices you are just forced to pick. That is what we are seeing so far in Amirdrassil, and what we have seen so far going deeper in the raid. Now, this is perhaps a bit unfair, as this is specifically for the very later bosses, of course. If we go slightly lower down to something like Smolderon, the numbers perhaps are not nearly as bad. As you can see now, back to Smolderon, we start seeing more of the specs we didn't see before. We start seeing more Balanced Druid, which disappeared in the last couple of bosses. There are more mages now, right? So going deeper in the bosses is where things get more try-hard, get more competitive. But that is, that is the same for pretty much every other fight. Even if we go from Neltarion down to Rashok, the numbers get even wider, right? That is also true for all of the other previous tiers. So what is this video even about? What are we even doing today? Are we complaining? Are we asking Blizzard to give us more options in our raid compositions, right? Being able to actually pick what we want to play rather than what we are forced based on our composition. For example, imagine you were trying to form a raid group for progression in Mythic, and you already settled on running this comp of DPS for your raid. Well, knowing this comp for the DPS means you must have at least 1 healer as a priest, because you still need stamina. You also need to have at least 1 Holy Paladin, if not 2, or 1 Holy Paladin and 1 Prot Paladin, because you have no Ret Paladin and you still need both of the Paladin auras in your raid. You also still need at least 1 Brewmaster or 1 Mistweaver, because you still need the Monk debuff. And it technically wouldn't hurt to have a Blood Decay, for grips, for AMZ, if the fight requires it, cheating some mechanics with Death's Advance, etc, etc. So you're left with not really many options if you wanted to choose, let's say, a Resto Shaman or a Resto Druid. Those would start to be more closed off. as options by you having to fill the rest of your raid with the necessary buffs or debuffs that you need in your composition. So this is today's argument we are having. The fact that while things are still for now quite good in Mythic Plus when it comes to variety, when it comes to options for you to choose as a spec in the dungeon content, when it comes to the raid content, this season we are getting a little bit more tight in terms of options, in terms of viable specs when played at the high level of progression. Now, obviously, of course, as usual, much of this won't really matter for many guilds. If you are, in the orbit of being a world 600 guild, it's not really gonna matter if you try to play a Shadow Priest in your comp, or if you try to play with a balanced druid on Tindral instead of a Pharaoh druid, obviously. But these things, as usual, tend to have trickle-down effects. Things played by the very top players tend to trickle down on the lower level players, which will then trickle down on the lower level players, etc, etc, and that is what forms the meta of the game. That works for the raid as well, and also it can be, a signal. It can be a hint for the future expansions, the future tiers of the raid. If we continue to have this many mandatory picks required for your raid, whether it is a raid debuff, a long raid buff like stamina or intellect, a short raid buff or party-wide buff like Wind Fury Totem or things like PI, we are starting to get quite tight in the amount of options we have available when we want to form a raid group. And also, to finish, we have to remind this to everyone, this will also continue to be hurting the specs that don't actually bring anything. For example, in this case, the only reason why Hunter is even being brought to begin with is just because they have high damage. If Hunter wasn't having this much of a high damage, they would be in the same situation of something like Elemental Shaman, which is nowhere to be seen. Or you could be saying the exact reverse. The only reason why we see one mage in every single comp is because players need Arcane Intellect. Otherwise, if mage didn't bring Arcane Intellect, nobody would be bringing a mage, because you could be doing much better off with an extra BM Hunter or even an extra Havoc Demon Hunter or Assassination Rogue over an Arcane Mage. So this is the point of today's video on this Friday, the current situation when it comes to the variety and the options of picks, of specs in your raid composition, getting quite more tight in Amirdrassil, in the third raid of this expansion compared to what we have gotten up to this point. Let me guys know, of course, what is your take on this strictness of composition when it comes to the raid in this tier. I honestly don't see, even if I try to imagine it, many players just praising this system, as it just limits you in the amount of options and choices you can have when entering a raid. That being said though, I will still leave you to your own conclusions. So, with this out of the way, it's time to leave each other on this Friday. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yes, it got late. This was supposed to be done an hour ago, but things happened, problems ensued, so this is what we get for today.